But the food was just everything that's bad about English food. These stereotypes: grey, greasy, sullen, lumpen, cooked without care. It was like pig swill, breakfast. A fried egg that was ice, like an ice hockey puck. It sort of had a slight tang of old fish. And, great slabs of crappy bacon with all that white stuff all over it, and rancid fat, and sausages that, someone described as slurry-filled condoms.
Tom Parker Bowles was recently forced to leave an estate belonging to the Duchy of Cornwall. Yet the real shock wasn't his eviction. It was the phone call that followed just minutes later, a call that shattered the illusion of power protection and connections surrounding him. For years, Tom had acted as though a special door was always open to him. Sponsors, investors, and wealthy guests were led to believe he could grant them access to the royal world, to estates where ordinary people could not simply walk in. Then a palace official spoke up. A file was created. A formal complaint was lodged. It reached the very office where such matters ought to be handled. But then the file vanished. The complainant lost their job. From that moment on, Tom seemed to grasp a dangerous truth. No matter how far he crossed the line, there was always someone standing behind him to shield him. That person was his mother, Queen Camilla. But this time, Tom had gone too far, because the person waiting on the other side was neither a palace official who could be pressured nor someone willing to turn a blind eye. It was Prince Edward, and standing behind Edward was Prince William. Before we continue, if you enjoy gripping stories from behind the royal scenes, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you following this story from? Because from this moment forward, Tom was no longer merely leveraging the royal name for influence. He began to act as if he actually possessed a share of royal power himself. And that was exactly when everything started to fall apart. Tom seemed convinced that the perfect moment had finally arrived. The turning point came when King Charles III and Queen Camilla left the UK. With the media's attention largely focused on the royals' public engagements, Tom spotted a void, a space he believed no one cared enough to police. To others, it was merely a few days of the king and queen being away. But to Tom, it was an opportunity. As soon as Charles and Camilla departed, Tom began testing the boundaries. He started not with a massive event, but with private dinners and discreet meetings, bringing in guests in numbers small enough to avoid attracting notice. Each time no one stepped in to stop him, Tom pushed a little further. He began utilizing more space, bringing in more people, hauling in catering equipment, and most importantly, he began to give his guests the impression that they were attending something far more exclusive than a mere commercial event. They were stepping into a world accessible to very few. That was precisely the value Tom wanted to sell. He didn't need to explicitly claim official authority. He simply needed others to believe he was close enough to power, close to Camilla, close to Charles, and familiar enough with the grounds to open doors that ordinary people never even saw. Then Tom decided to go a step further. A grand gala was organized. Investors were invited. Sponsors came on board. Service staff were brought in. Catering equipment was installed. The venue was decorated to evoke an air of formality far beyond that of a standard corporate dinner. And then there was a detail that made the whole affair impossible to ignore. An emblem bearing a striking resemblance to the royal coat of arms was incorporated into the decor. It wasn't an exact replica, yet it was similar enough for those entering the room to grasp the message Tom intended to convey. This was no ordinary party. This was a venue with ties to the royal family. At the very least, that was what Tom wanted everyone to believe. In his mind, things were likely proceeding exactly according to plan. Charles was not there, neither was Camilla. The media's attention was focused elsewhere, and the guests in the room looked to Tom as someone who could offer them something ordinary. Money could not buy proximity to power. But there was a problem Tom failed to see. Reports were already making their way out of the estate. Every detail, every name, every activity. And within a short time, that information reached Prince William's office. William was aware of the situation. He immediately grasped just how sensitive it was. If William were to show up and confront Tom Parker Bowles directly, the story would cease to be merely a matter of estate management. It would instantly escalate into a confrontation between the Prince of Wales and Queen Camilla's son. The stakes were even higher because William was currently engaged in private discussions with Charles regarding the management, protection, and modernization of royal assets. A public scandal could derail that entire process. So William did not go. He issued no statement. He did not call Tom directly. He chose a colder approach. A call was made. On the other end of the line was Prince Edward. And as Edward prepared to take action, Tom was still raising his glass, with people who believed he stood very close to the seat of power. He had no idea that the person about to walk through the door would prove otherwise. And that person was Prince Edward. The call from William was brief. This was not a discussion to weigh whether Tom should be warned, asked for an explanation, or given another chance. The decision had already been made. Edward was granted the necessary authority to handle the situation right there on the estate. No delays, no negotiating with Tom, and most importantly, no need to wait for Charles to return. Edward fully understood the nature of this task. He was not arriving as an uncle stepping in to resolve an awkward family squabble. Nor was he there to debate whether Tom genuinely believed he was entitled to do what he was doing. He was there to enforce a line that had already been drawn. And while that decision was being set in motion, Tom remained completely unaware of what was about to unfold. That night, rain poured down outside the estate. But inside the hall, the atmosphere was entirely different. Light bathed the meticulously prepared tables. Wine was poured. Staff moved among the guests. Conversations about money connections and opportunities filled the room, which was packed with investors and sponsors. At the center of it all was Tom Parker Bowles. Holding a glass of wine, he moved from one group of guests to another with the ease of a man who never once considered that he might be standing on land where his right to be there could be challenged at any moment. On the contrary, Tom acted as if he were the host, and that perhaps was the most dangerous thing of all. For after repeatedly crossing minor boundaries without consequence, it seemed Tom no longer felt he was testing limits at all. He acted as though those limits did not exist. Then the door opened. Prince Edward walked in. There was no loud warning, no shouting. There was no immediate confrontation. Edward simply walked in and observed. For the first few seconds, many guests didn't even grasp why he had appeared. Neither did Tom. But what Tom didn't know was that Edward hadn't come alone. His people had already been given their instructions. While the room's attention began to shift toward Edward, another group headed straight for the service area. They didn't ask Tom. They didn't seek his permission. They began inspecting the equipment that had been brought onto the premises. Every item was logged. Service staff were ordered to halt their work. Some of the equipment began to be disconnected from the power supply. The operations that just minutes earlier had made the room look like a fully functioning gala began to grind to a halt section by section. At first, it was just a minor change. One service station fell silent. Then another. People mid-conversation turned to look. Staff exchanged glances. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Tom finally realized what was happening. He glanced toward the kitchen area, then at the people cataloging his equipment. Then his gaze settled on Edward. And in that very moment, Tom understood this was no social call. Edward hadn't come to dine. He had come to put an end to it. But Tom didn't back down. He didn't ask what was going on, nor did he seek a private room to resolve the matter discreetly. Instead, Tom straightened his posture, tightened his grip on his wine glass, and walked across the room. Conversations around him began to die down. Investors turned around. Staff stood frozen, all eyes gradually focused on the two men as they approached each other. Edward remained silent. Tom stopped right in front of him. This was the moment Tom still believed the name backing him carried enough weight to force Edward to back down. And in front of the entire room, Tom looked Edward straight in the eye and coldly declared, "You have no right to be here." Tom's words rang out loudly enough for those standing nearby to hear. But Tom didn't stop there. He declared that the gala was being held with Queen Camilla's blessing. The way he emphasized her name suggested he believed the confrontation was over the moment she was mentioned. Camilla was his mother. Camilla was the queen. And in Tom's mind, that alone was enough to make anyone standing before him think twice. But Edward didn't react. He simply stood there, no arguing, no explaining. He didn't even try to interrupt Tom. That silence should have served as a warning. But Tom interpreted it in exactly the opposite way. He pushed even further. Tom looked at Edward in front of the investors and guests and mocked his standing within the royal family. He insinuated that Edward belonged to a generation that no longer truly held sway. Then Tom brought William into the mix. If William really had an issue with the event, Tom wanted to know why he hadn't come himself. Why send Edward? Did the Prince of Wales not want to face Camilla's son in person? Or was Edward simply dispatched to do the dirty work William didn't want to handle himself? The room grew increasingly silent. Yet Tom pressed on. He spoke of a new world where power stemmed from more than just titles or antiquated protocols. To Tom, true power lay in money-media connections and the ability to step into the rooms where decisions were actually made. And then he went even further. Tom spoke as if the Parker Bowles family were not outsiders looking in at the monarchy, but rather an integral part of its future. It was a moment where his confidence bordered on open defiance. Edward let him keep talking, until Tom ran out of things to say. Only then did Edward reply. There was no long speech, no debate over status. He made just one thing clear. Tom had no authority to host this event. And the permission Tom claimed to have received from Camilla changed nothing, because the right to manage the estate belonged to Prince William. The room fell silent. Then Edward stated a figure that changed everything instantly. 60 minutes. Tom had exactly 60 minutes to remove the equipment, the staff, and all his guests from the property. Not the next morning. Not after the party ended. That very night. And if they remained past the deadline, Edward warned the matter would be treated as trespassing. Before Tom could even react, Edward's team sprang into action. Power to the service area was cut. Part of the room suddenly went silent. Crates of wine were carried out. Catering equipment was dismantled. Staff were ordered to pack up. Then came the emblem resembling the royal crest that Tom had displayed at the event. It was taken down from the wall. And perhaps no image illustrated the shift in power more clearly than that moment. Just minutes earlier, Tom had stood in the center of the room as a man capable of opening the royal door to anyone he chose. Now, right in front of the very investors and sponsors he had hoped to impress, those symbols of power were being dismantled. No one stepped up to defend Tom. No one asked Edward to stop. Tom looked around the room. Then he glanced at his watch. The 60 minutes were ticking away, and for the first time that night, the confidence on his face began to fade. Tom turned sharply toward his assistant. He still had one name left, someone he had believed for years was just a phone call away from opening every door again. Tom told his assistant to get the phone. "Call Camilla." Just moments later, the call connected. And right from her opening words, Camilla made no secret of her anger. She demanded that the removal be halted immediately. In Camilla's view, there was no reason to turn an internal matter into a public confrontation before a crowd of investors, sponsors, and guests. There was no need to humiliate Tom in a room full of people just to prove who was in charge. She wanted Edward to rescind the order. Let the evening conclude. Let Tom leave without creating a scene. And if there were indeed issues to address, they should wait for King Charles to return. Charles could review the situation. Charles could speak with William. Charles could handle it within the family. But Edward hadn't come there to wait for Charles. The decision had been made, and he had no intention of changing it. Camilla kept speaking. Her voice grew increasingly firm, as if applying enough pressure would eventually force Edward to yield. But then something happened that Tom seemed completely unprepared for. Edward ended the call. Camilla was still speaking when the line went dead. For a few seconds, the room fell into a stunned silence. Not because a phone call had just ended, but because everyone present understood exactly what they had just witnessed. Tom had called the one person he believed could put a stop to it all. Yet even the mention of Camilla's name hadn't made Edward back down. Tom looked at the phone. Then he looked at Edward. His confidence began to give way to anger, for by now an undeniable truth had set in. No one was coming to his rescue. The managers continued to usher Tom toward the exit. And that was the moment he lost control. Tom turned his attack on Charles, mocking a king who, by his account, had spent too long waiting for the throne, only to have his key decisions shaped by his own son. Then he turned his sights on William. Tom branded William a control freak, a man so obsessed with safeguarding the future of the crown that he was willing to draw lines even with his own family. Edward was not spared either. Tom dismissed him as William's tool sent to stage a confrontation the Prince of Wales didn't want to engage in personally. Then Harry was brought up. Catherine was dragged into it too. His words were no longer aimed at defending himself. They were hurled to wound. But then the anger shifted into something more dangerous. Tom began to make threats. He claimed to have been in rooms where outsiders were never permitted. He had overheard conversations that were never meant for his ears. He knew things about Charles, about William, about Harry, about Catherine. And if the family truly wanted to turn this into a war, Tom warned they had better understand the cost. He declared he knew enough to drag their private secrets into the public eye. Yet no one rushed to stop the handlers. Not a single investor stepped forward to defend Tom. Not one guest placed themselves between him and Edward. Tom was still shouting as he was ushered toward the exit. And then the door closed in his face. Just minutes earlier, Tom had stood in the center of the hall, raising a glass to those who believed he could bring them closer to royal power. Now he stood on the other side of the door, alone. But inside, Edward knew it wasn't over, for Camilla had just been cut off in front of the very people she had wanted to shield Tom from humiliating. And this time, the issue was no longer just about her son being evicted from a piece of land. It had become a question of Camilla's own power. The phone rang again. Edward looked down at the screen. Camilla was calling back. This time he answered the phone. But from the very first seconds, Camilla made it clear she wasn't calling to negotiate. Her tone was firmer than before. She emphasized her position as queen consort, insisting that Edward could not simply dismiss her request and carry on as if the previous call had never happened. In Camilla's view, the matter had escalated far beyond the scope of a mere gala. Her son had just been removed from the premises in front of numerous guests. Tom's reputation was at stake, and if Edward pushed the issue further, the consequences could spiral out of control. Yet Edward remained calm. He made it clear that he was not acting on personal opinion. He was carrying out a decision handed down by Prince William. And that was the moment the entire conversation shifted. Edward explained that Camilla's position within the royal family did not automatically grant her control over assets under William's management. If Camilla believed otherwise, Edward offered a very simple option. Prove it. Not with a phone call, not with her name, not with personal influence. Produce the documentation. Then Edward fell silent. There was silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. No document was produced. No order was cited. And when Camilla spoke again, her tone had changed. The firmness began to fade. She no longer spoke much about her position. There was no more arguing over who held higher authority. No more demands for Edward to back down. Instead, Camilla began to talk about Tom, about what would happen if the incident became an official record. If reports were filed, if the allegations continued to be pursued. What if the story moved beyond the estate gates and into a process that even she could no longer control? She worried about her son's future. Tom had just been thrown out. He had been humiliated in front of people who once viewed him as a man of influence. For Camilla, perhaps that was enough. She asked Edward not to take the matter any further. Let tonight end here. Don't turn this into a legal record that could dog Tom for years. Don't let a single night of lost control define the rest of his life. The voice that used to issue orders to Edward no longer sounded like a command. It had become almost a plea. And in that very moment, those close enough to overhear the exchange understood they were witnessing something far greater than just Tom being removed from an estate. For in that moment, titles hardly mattered. There was no queen consort debating authority, no clash between two branches of power. There was only a mother trying to shield her son from the consequences closing in on him. Edward listened. He did not mock Camilla. He did not raise his voice, nor did he seize the moment to declare victory. He listened just long enough to understand what she was asking. But he understood something else, too. If the matter were dropped simply because Camilla pleaded, the very boundary William had just established would instantly lose its meaning. So Edward made no promises. He did not say the file would vanish. He did not say Tom would be shielded from what came next. And even as Camilla tried to explain that the repercussions for her son could last far longer than a single night of being ejected from the estate, Edward ended the call. Silence filled the room. No one rushed to speak, for those present had just heard something they likely never imagined witnessing just hours before. Camilla had gone from issuing commands to pleading, and the most terrifying thing for her was that even that plea could not change the decision. But if Camilla thought Tom's departure from the estate marked the end of the matter, she was mistaken. For even as Edward ended the call, another process was already underway. And this time, the person behind it was Prince William. When the full report arrived, William wanted to know more than just what had happened on the night of the party. He wanted to know how Tom had used the estate prior to that evening, for how long and with whom, and most importantly, how the situation had been allowed to unfold without being stopped sooner. William ordered a comprehensive audit, not just of the guest list, not just of the equipment that had been discovered, but also of venue usage, records, repair costs, commercial activities, and security-related issues. As the documents were gathered, the picture that emerged was far more alarming than merely that of an unauthorized party. The review revealed that Tom had allegedly been using the estate for private commercial ventures. Events were being hosted, money was being generated, yet the revenue was bypassing the estate's official management systems. Then there were the physical concerns. Certain equipment brought in for these events reportedly compromised historic structures that required protection. Repair bills began to surface. Damages were documented, but financial concerns were not the most serious aspect of the situation. Security was the real issue. The guests Tom brought onto the estate did not always undergo screening procedures commensurate with the site's sensitivity. This meant that an individual with no official role was effectively deciding who could enter, who gained access, and who could approach areas that should have been under strict control. For William, this was the point where the nature of the situation changed completely. If Tom had simply thrown a single unauthorized party, it might have been an isolated infraction. But if similar activities had occurred repeatedly involving money guests' equipment and access all managed outside official channels, then the issue went far beyond a single night. It was a matter of a system that had been allowed to persist. And the question William needed to answer was no longer simply, what did Tom do? But rather, how was Tom able to do it? Who knew these events were taking place? Who saw the guests being ushered in? Who received the invoices? Whoever asked questions? Who chose to remain silent? And then a more uncomfortable question arose. What had happened to previous complaints? William was reminded of a file once compiled by a palace staffer, someone who had tried to sound the alarm about how Tom was exploiting his connections and access. That complaint had been submitted. Then it vanished. The person who raised the alarm was no longer in their post. At this point, the audit shifted its focus beyond Tom alone. It began to trace the entire path those earlier warnings had taken. Every document, every decision, every person who had the chance to speak up but didn't. William now held a picture far larger than the one Edward had seen when he walked into the hall that night. Tom hadn't simply become brazen overnight. He had had ample time to convince himself that no one would stop him. Each time a complaint disappeared, that conviction grew stronger. Each time a door opened, Tom took another step forward, until he went too far. And now William was retracing every one of those steps. The audit began with Tom Parker Bowles. But when the old files were laid on the table, and the question of the vanished complaints was raised, eyes in the room gradually turned toward another name. Queen Camilla. That was the name that kept resurfacing as the audit finally got underway. But by this point, the issue went far beyond mere paperwork. It came down to how people perceived Tom Parker Bowles. For what Tom lost that night was not simply the right to enter a particular estate. He lost something far more significant: the confidence of those who had once believed he wielded real influence. Investors who had sat at the same table as Tom witnessed the events firsthand. They saw Edward walk in. They saw the gala dismantled. They saw the symbols Tom used to project a sense of closeness to the royal family being stripped from the walls. And most importantly, they saw what happened after the call to Camilla. She could not force Edward to stop. She could not reverse William's decision. She could not get Tom back into the room. In a single night, the standing Tom had spent years building began to lose its value. For influence exists only as long as others believe it to be real. And when that belief vanishes, so too does borrowed power. Tom had once been able to walk into rooms, giving the impression that he was under royal protection. But now those who had once sought to be close to him were forced to ask themselves, if Camilla could not protect her own son in a confrontation like this, what doors could Tom truly open anymore? That shift did not affect Tom alone. Its repercussions rippled back into the heart of the palace. Those who had seen the problem but chosen silence began to reevaluate their own decisions. Previously, they might have assumed that crossing Tom meant crossing Camilla. And crossing Camilla could mean pitting themselves against King Charles III. It was precisely the fear of that chain of power that had led so many to remain silent. But after the gala, that chain of command was no longer certain. Edward demonstrated that an order grounded in clear administrative authority could withstand personal pressure. William also showed he was willing to defend the boundaries of his power, even when the person on the other side was a family member. That is why this story does not end with Tom. It was Edward who walked into the room. It was Edward who issued the ultimatum. It was Edward who refused to back down. But it was William who drew the line. Tom was the first to run up against that line. Camilla was the one who discovered that personal influence is not always enough to cross it. And Charles, though not directly present at the decisive moment, remains at the heart of the larger question. How far can a family go in protecting one another before that protection clashes with institutional responsibility? That is the real issue remaining after the door has closed. For if the audit continues, if old files are reopened, and if grievances that once vanished are brought back to the table, the story might not stop at Tom Parker Bowles losing access to an estate. It could evolve into a broader examination of how power was wielded, who was shielded, and who chose to remain silent. And if that happens, the question will no longer be, did Tom Parker Bowles go too far? Instead, it will be, who allowed him to believe he could go that far? So in your opinion, is Prince William doing what is necessary to protect the royal family and re-establish accountability? Or has he turned a family matter into a power struggle with Camilla? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. And if you want to keep up with the stories, conflicts, and latest developments behind royal doors, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue bringing you compelling stories. Thank you for watching.